This is a blessed book which we have revealed to you, O Muhammad, that they might reflect upon its verses and that those of understanding would be reminded.
Do you know what Islam is? It's a way of life for all. It is taught in the Quran for big and small. Do you know what Islam says? It says that life's the greatest test. It says that life's a borrowed space, returned upon rest.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome again. With me today is Dr. Zia Sheikh, the Imam of Irving Islamic Center in Texas. Imam Zia is a PhD in the Islamic Studies, and he's a professor at Mishkat University in North America, the Islamic University in North America. He's also an author. And today, we're going to discuss some aspects he touched on in his book, which is called Islam Silencing the Critics. Imam Zia tackles many controversies surrounding the misconceptions spread by certain people about Islam in the West and in the United States in particular. He approached those issues with clarity and simplicity that makes his points very clear, even for the less knowledgeable people about Islam. We're going to discuss a few of those issues Imam Zia discussed in his book, and we're going to start by asking him why he wrote this book at the beginning. Imam Zia, welcome again to our program, and we hope we can go in depth today and in the following few days about your book, about the issues you discussed in your book. But first, tell us again, a little bit in details, the reasons behind this book.
First of all, thank you for having me on the program. Secondly, the reason for writing the book is that post 9/11, there has been a huge attack against Islam. You can say there is a vendetta against Islam, to malign Islam, to criticize Islam, to put Islam down. And the reason or the excuse that the people have of criticizing or rebuking or maligning Islam is simply the fact that we had the tragic incident of 9/11. And now, bringing that as an excuse and then bringing different issues and making false accusations against Islam has been a very common thing that has happened, especially in the United States, and unfortunately it's also spreading to Europe. So I basically got frustrated one day, and I thought to myself that somebody has to sit down and write one book which is a reference point to answer all of these criticisms, all of the bad things that are being said about Islam, and that's why I sat down to write this book, and I called it Islam Silencing the Critics, because of this very reason.
Can you share with me what is the most frustrating thing you found through your research, through your dealing with people? You travel a lot around the United States, you talk to a lot of Muslims, and you lead a very large size community. What do you think is the most frustrating thing facing the Muslims?
The most frustrating thing is the issue of ignorance from the non-Muslims about Islam. Statistically, we've seen that any person who knows a Muslim, who has interacted with a Muslim, he has a favorable image of Islam and Muslims. A person who has no interaction with a Muslim, he has an unfavorable image about Islam and Muslims, because he is relying on hearsay and the media to give him information about Islam. So this is the most frustrating thing, to quell the ignorance of people and to make sure that they are going to the right resources and get the right information about Islam, this is the most frustrating thing, that sometimes you just cannot succeed because over and over again the talking points are mentioned and the criticisms are mentioned, and that is the most frustrating thing.
The talking points. So some people are doing the talking, basically. Can you mention some of these talking points, some of the names of those people who are spreading the misinformation and preying on the ignorance of?
Well, the talking points mainly range from the issue of honor killings of girls, the issue of Muslims worshipping a so-called moon god, terrorism being exclusively an Islamic thing, things of that nature. These are the talking points that are always pushed across. The issue of assassinating the character of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ with fabricated narrations, and basically character assassination of Islam and Muslims, just so that people get afraid of learning about Islam and Muslims. This is the issue that we face. And the people that are doing it are in many shapes and forms. You get them, first of all, in organizations that are solely set out to basically criticize Islam. For example, Act for America. This is a very prominent organization which has chapters everywhere, and it has a very large following. And it's led by a person named Bridget Gabriel, amongst other people. And the whole purpose is to, quote unquote, save America from the Islamic threat which America is facing. As if, there's going to be like a tidal wave of Islam which is just going to cover the nation, which is idiotic in its and stupid in its claim, first and foremost, that Muslims, being just 1% or even less than 1% of the whole population of America, how can they influence the situation in America to such a degree that they just overtake the whole country? It's impossible in the first place, but people, unfortunately, just fall for that propaganda, and they become brainwashed because of it. So from an organizational level, there are people who are doing this. They have their own organizations, and sometimes that organization, it portrays a sense of credibility, and they even write papers which look like academic papers, but if you really dig deep into those academic or so-called academic papers, they really have no kind of backbone. They have no reality, and all of the same rehashed stuff comes up again and again and again. And if a person really has any knowledge about Islam, he can answer those criticisms very easily.
Simple common sense siphoning process will lead you to that, really, no matter how educated you are, what your level of knowledge of Islam. If you take little time to siphon through that, you get to that conclusion. You mentioned one name, Bridget Gabriel. There are more. I'm sure in your research you came across people like Walid Shwaybat. You came across some preachers, highly profiled preachers in the United States. Do you think having certain religious personalities and certain academic personalities behind this misinformation, given it enough credibility to influence the decision makers too, not just the ignorant public?
Yes. If you, again, it all boils down to people who align themselves with the right wing, the extreme right, neocons, Tea Party, whatever you want to call them. If a person is aligned to that side of the political spectrum, you will find that they are actually brainwashed into taking these things as fact. For example, Newt Gingrich, supposedly very intelligent man, supposedly a person who has been in politics for a long time, but he comes out with things like Palestine didn't even exist before 1947. There was no such thing as Palestine, which I've mentioned in my book. So how can you expect that from an educated person? How can you expect that from a person who is one of the leadership and who even tried to become the president of America. So yes, even the policymakers are influenced by these kinds of people because of the kind of air of credibility that they portray by writing academic papers and so on, or things which look like academic papers but really have no backbone, which I do mention in the book.
That leads me to the funding for these people. I mean, they are on TV, they are in the paper everywhere, every newspaper carries their articles and their so-called research and finding, and they claim they are experts on terrorism, experts on Islam, experts on the Middle East issues, and you cannot do that for free. And I know for a fact, I know some people, I had personal contact with them who are making an extremely good living, if not saying they are building a wealth out of this. It became an industry. Can you touch a little bit about the sources of funding? In addition to the public funding they are getting from individuals who are so gullible, they are given in a generous way, thinking they are serving their religion or serving a goal, noble goal. Can you touch on that?
Well, there is a report that has been written by certain organizations in the US, which is called Fear Inc., which is a free downloadable report that talks about who is funding these organizations on a very high level. Hundreds of thousands of dollars are being siphoned into their accounts, and they are using this money to just only criticize Islam.
And your book touches on that?
Yes, it touches upon that. One of them, for example, is the Clarion Fund. Okay, and there are similar organizations that have the same kind of donations that are given, and on top of that, they're probably getting generous tax breaks because of it, because these organizations are so-called 501c3 organizations that they are actually donating to. So this is one source, and like you mentioned also, they are getting their funding from public appearances. Some of these guys, so-called ex-Muslims or so-called ex-terrorists, they actually demand appearance fees in the tens of thousands of dollars. So a church might invite them, or a college might invite them, and their speaking fees are in. Absolutely.
Ex-terrorists,
Yeah.
so-called, and elaborate a little bit on the ex-terrorist, ex-Muslim.
Yeah. These people actually, they have recognized that to be an ex-Muslim is a very lucrative industry in the US. Because once a person leaves Islam, then he has an audience that he can turn to, and he can present the quote-unquote barbaric Islam that I left, and now I found peace in leaving Islam. So there's a ready audience that is willing to pay for this, to see this person, to talk to this person, and to have a book signed by them, which is again another source of their income. Books which are being sold in the thousands, and of course they're making a lot of money from it. So one of them is this person that you just mentioned earlier, Walid Shuaibat, and I mentioned that his credibility about being an ex-terrorist has been scrutinized by many people, and the reality is that he was not an ex-terrorist, but he claims to be an ex-terrorist. And obviously, if he was an ex-terrorist, if he was aligned with terrorist organizations, first and foremost, he would not have got his green card in this country. He would not.
He should have been in jail, actually, for the things he claims he did. Regardless if you repented or not, you have to pay for the crime.
Absolutely. This is the very important thing, that when a person applies for his green card or he applies for his citizenship, one of the main questions that comes up is, have you ever been aligned with any terrorist organization in anywhere in the world? And if a person claims to have done that, first and foremost, he's not going to be allowed into this country. His green card application will be revoked. He's going to be thrown out of the country. But we see that this person, he has green card, he has citizenship, and not only does he have citizenship, but he's making a lot of money in this country with the claims that he's making and with the books that he's written.
He's exploiting freedom of speech that we enjoy in here, that is protected, and he can lie. There is no laws against lying, but there are laws against crimes and terrorism.
Absolutely.
However, the FBI found out he's a fake, basically. and that's why they didn't lock him up.
Absolutely. That's
But
the
he
very
can
reason.
go and claim, I was a terrorist, I bombed this, I did that.
True.
And unfortunately, the gullible people are giving him an audience.
Yeah. Even more ludicrous is another person called Kamel Saleem.
Yes.
Now, his book, it claims that he's met every single dictator in the world. He says he's met Gaddafi, he's met Saddam Hussein, he's met Yasser Arafat. I mean, people, it's just amazing. And somebody actually who criticized this guy says that it seems like he was the James Bond of the Middle East, that he's basically gone through so many adventures in his life that you could actually make movies out of them. It was so ludicrous, the claims that he has been making. And again, people fall for those claims and accept them as being factual. Again, the same thing, he's in the US, his books are being sold, and the gullible and naive people just lap it up because they find it fascinating that an ex-Muslim is he's repented and accepted Christ as his Savior and found peace. So that becomes a very lucrative selling point.
Absolutely. What is the most ridiculous thing you found in your research while you were writing this book?
Well, there are many ridiculous things. For example, and people will just jump on anything that will give them fuel to criticize Islam. For example, any crescent symbol, the memorial that was put in the Philadelphia plane crash, where the plane crashed on 9/11, that had some semblance of a crescent on it. So people jumped on that and they said, well, see, this is Islam being even thrown in our face, even in the memorial of 9/11. So, and then things of that nature that you come across, the issue of halal turkeys, which were being sold by a company called Butterball. People jumped on that and said, look, we are being fed Sharia without us even knowing that we are eating halal turkeys, and we need to do something about this because the Muslims are taking over. And then you can go on and on about these ridiculous things and ridiculous claims that people make about Islam and the Muslims in this country.
And all of that is nothing but enjoying the freedom that gives you the opportunity to do certain practices in your religion without the fear of any persecution. And yet, if you want to practice a virtue just for the Muslims, then you are exposed in this negative way. And the issue is exploited again by these people you've been talking about.
True.
And you mentioned in your book.
True.
To take advantage of the situation and further the riches, basically. In your book, you pointed out that there's a perception about the slaughtering the animals that's, as it is inhumane. Since we started talking about some of these points they bring, and then they use them. They use the misinformation about them to gain the public support, let's say, or their audience, keep them engaged. Touch on that issue, the issue of slaughter. In our religion, Islam, we have certain dietary laws and we have to do things in certain ways.
Right.
How different that is from other people who are doing it.
Right. First and foremost, we need to look at the source of Islam, which is the Quran and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. What does Prophet Muhammad say about slaughtering an animal? He says that if you are slaughtering an animal, you should be gentle and you should be kind with that animal. You should use a sharp knife and you should say the name of Allah, and you should basically let that animal bleed. Scientifically, the only pain that the animal will feel is at the time of the knife swiping across the neck, and even that, if it's a very sharp knife, that pain will be very, very minimal. After the animal starts bleeding a little bit, then the animal will pass out and there will be no more pain. And the reason for this method of slaughter is that when you slaughter an animal this way, what happens is the heart continues to beat. When the heart continues to beat, it allows the blood to drain out completely. Once the blood has drained out completely, what you get is a very clean cut of meat with no blood clots or things of that nature, which if it is still prevalent in meat, then it actually spoils the meat. So this
the blood carries a lot of bacteria, germs and bacteria in it.
Absolutely. The blood is the actual source of many of the illnesses that are found in the system. And that's why when we give a blood test, that's what they test for. They test the blood for bacteria, viruses, and things of that nature. So the draining of the animal of this blood, it will actually clean the animal. Now, this method of slaughter is not just specific to the Muslims. The actual method of slaughter is also practiced by the Jews, which is the kosher or the kashrut method of slaughter. It's exactly the same, and that's why Muslims are actually allowed to eat from kosher meat, because it's been slaughtered exactly the same way with the same specifications as the Muslims adhere to. Now, the strange thing is that the Christians or people other than Jews and Muslims, they are also obligated to follow the same dietary laws. If you look at the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Leviticus, it actually tells that the Christians are not supposed to eat pork, they're not supposed to eat any kind of pig meat, but the rules have been changed over the years. They say that the New Testament has allowed us to eat everything. Everything is permissible for us now. And that is kind of strange.
Because Jesus kept the law.
Yes.
And from studying his life, he was a rabbi practicing Jew, highly practicing Jew.
Absolutely.
Since we're talking about those issues, the issue is of polygamy. This is another controversial issue that critics and propagandists use against Islam and Muslims. You talked about that in your book. Can you give our audience and our viewers a summary of what's being said and where Islam stands on this issue and where we Muslims stand on it in the United States?
Right. Yeah, first of all, we should be very clear that we have to observe the law of the land, and we have to adhere to what the law says about polygamy, that we are not allowed to engage in polygamy while resident in the United States. So that is something that we adhere to as the law of the land, and we don't impose Sharia on the country by trying to circumvent the laws and to practice our own laws. That's not permissible. But having said that, the issue of polygamy comes under a lot of scrutiny. But even Christian scholars have actually said that the Bible makes no mention of restricting the wife to one wife. The Bible has no mention of that at all. The church chose to do that. And in fact, there are many church laws that are not found in the Bible. For example, the Roman Catholics, they don't allow their priests to marry. But if you ask a priest, where does it say that a priest is not supposed to get married in the Bible, they'll say, no, it's not a biblical law, this is a church law. So that's why you'll find many denominations of Christians, they do get married, and Roman Catholics don't get married. So just church law is sometimes even supersedes the Bible. So from a biblical perspective, there is no mention of the restriction of having one wife. And in fact, you look at the stories of Solomon and the previous prophets, peace be upon all of them, they were all married with multiple wives, and this was supposed to be a very normal thing to do. Now, fast forward 1400, 1500, 2000 years later, and we find that although the restriction in many countries in the West is to one wife, but people will engage in serial polygamy from a perspective of having one wife but having many mistresses on the side, and having children out of wedlock and being irresponsible when it comes to looking after them and taking care of them. So what is better? I asked this question in the book. What is better? Is polygamy with a person being committed to those multiple wives, committed to taking care of them financially, and committed to looking after the children that are born into that family, is it better, or to sleep around and have multiple children out of wedlock and engage in promiscuity and probably end up with some kind of STD or sexually transmitted disease?
In addition to that, I want you to talk about polygamy being a solution to a social problem, not a virtue, as some people make it to be, as you must have more than one wife. You must practice it. In Islam, it is not. It discourages you, actually. So would you please elaborate on that and clarify it to our viewers, Muslims and non-Muslims?
Right. Yes, as you mentioned, that some people think that it's some kind of a fantasy.
Or a luxury.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, polygamy, some people regard it as some kind of a fantasy thing, that a person has multiple wives and a harem, and he goes and all the wives are serving him and all that kind of stuff. So that is, things that you find in the movies, and that is not the reality of what happens. Polygamy is sometimes a necessity, and that is, for example, a woman, for example, who loses a husband to death. She has 3 or 4 children. It's very, very unlikely that a single man is going to take up the responsibility of, bringing up 4 children that don't belong to him, and therefore, she is left alone to fend for herself. So in this case, a person would step in and take her as a second wife, with the intention of, first of all, looking after her and also looking after the children. And there are so many different scenarios that you can come across that will be helpful in alleviating a lot of social problems that are prevalent in many societies. For example, the Iraq War. When the women, they became refugees and they went to countries like Lebanon and Syria, etc., as refugees, they had nobody to support them. Their husbands had passed away, and many of them were forced into prostitution to provide for their children. Now, is prostitution better, or is it better for them to be married into a household where a husband looks after them and takes care of them and looks after the children, or was prostitution better? So these social problems, they can be alleviated if we look at polygamy as a solution to many problems and not as a fantasy as some people portray it as.
That's true. And some of the critics, as I mentioned, say, why is it allowed for women and it is allowed only for men? Would you please clarify that?
The issue is that in most cases, the women would outnumber men in the first place. So the issue, really, the need occurs with women in the first place. A man, when he has kids or he gets divorced, then it is, it is very rare that he is with the children, and it's easy for him to get married again. He doesn't have that burden that the woman has. A person can be divorced, he can be widowed, but it is still easy for him to get married. Secondly, the issue is that in the case of women getting married in a polygamous way, they would not know who the father is of the child. You can say, well, DNA would resolve that issue, but still, it is still unethical from many perspectives that a woman should be the bearer of many children through many husbands. It is unethical. It has always been unethical, and it's not
societies, not only religious societies, actually.
In all societies, that has been the case. And then the issue is the mental and psychological mindset of a woman is that it's very difficult for her to be focused on more than one person at a time. And that is why, in fact, that women, after they have a breakup or their husband dies, they cannot focus and they cannot get remarried immediately. There's an Islamic law that they have to go through.
They need an adjustment period, actually.
Right, which is called the period of iddah in Islam. They need at least 3 months to get over their loss. They need 3 months or so to get over the divorce that has taken place. And then slowly, psychologically, they prepare themselves, mentally prepare themselves for another husband. So psychologically, it's very difficult for a woman to concentrate on more than one man at a time. So this is again the reason that women are not allowed to have more than one husband.
That's a very good point. We're going to stop right here and we'll pick up with other virtues and other points hopefully in the next program. Thank you for being with us again.
Thank you.
And inshallah, we'll be continuing with Dr. Zia Sheikh book about silencing the critics of Islam. Stay tuned to our next episode and we'll leave you in peace. May peace be with you and see you next time.
This is a blessed book which we have revealed to you, O Muhammad, that they might reflect upon its verses and that those of understanding would be reminded.
Do you know what Islam is? It's a way of life for all. It is taught in the Quran for big and small. Do you know what Islam says? It says that life's the greatest test. It says that life's a borrowed space returned upon rest.